The jury had officially begun deliberating in the criminal trial against Sean Diddy Combs. After weeks of intense testimony and presentation of evidence, the responsibility now lay in their hands. Would they determine he was guilty of the federal sex crime charge or not guilty? Would they become deadlocked and unable to reach a consensus? The court had now entered the next critical phase, and there was much to unpack about the developments of the day. This included an unexpected and particularly startling question from the jury that turned heads. Jesse Weber introduced the episode, welcoming everyone to Sidebar Law and Crime's coverage. It was now official, the verdict watch had begun. Jurors were instructed to begin deliberations that morning. There were notable developments, including a series of jury notes that were both intriguing and revealing. Adding to the complexity, the jury instructions themselves were dense, so intricate that Jesse openly questioned whether the jurors would be able to make sense of them easily. He wouldn't be surprised if they found parts of it difficult to digest, especially considering the charges involved: racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transporting individuals to engage in prostitution. These weren't straightforward counts, they demanded serious scrutiny. If Combs were found guilty, he could face decades, possibly even life in prison. To break down what had happened, Jesse brought in Law and Crime's in-court reporter Elizabeth Milner, a fan favorite. He welcomed her warmly and asked about the state of deliberations. How long had they gone on before the jury requested to go home at 5 p.m.? Elizabeth responded that deliberations had lasted nearly 5 hours on day one. The jury had notified the court around 5 p.m. that they wished to conclude for the day and would resume early the following morning. Despite being just the first day, they had already submitted several important questions to the judge, especially regarding the jury instructions and legal definitions. Jesse highlighted that there had been 3 jury notes in total, 1 early on and 2 more near the day's end. Elizabeth explained the first note was straightforward. The jurors had chosen a 4-person, juror number 5. There was brief confusion over whether the number referred to their seat or their designation from voir dire, but it was quickly clarified. Juror number 5 was a religious man, an investment analyst, and a member of a Connecticut country club. He would be the one to deliver the verdict in court once a decision was reached. That was their first communication. Then came the controversial note, the one everyone had started discussing. It arrived around 1:30 p.m., though it had likely been drafted nearly an hour earlier. The message concerned juror number 25 and claimed that this juror could not follow the judge's instructions. Initially, the court proposed responding with a question. Was this an issue of misunderstanding, or was it a refusal to comply? Juror 25, a 51-year-old scientist, had been quiet through voir dire but was now the subject of serious concern. The defense urged caution, preferring that the jurors be encouraged to work through any confusion rather than isolating one of their own so early in the process. They were hesitant to provide a list of possible interpretations. The government, however, pushed for clarity and wanted the judge to reference existing case law. Their proposed response emphasized the importance of not revealing where any juror stood on guilt or innocence. After a pause for debate, the judge ultimately composed a neutral message that addressed both sides' concerns, though it leaned more toward the government's request. For a few hours after that, the court received no further notes. Then, near the day's end, more communications came through. Jesse took a brief aside, addressing any viewers in business, recommending sponsor software, a tool that manages inventory, sales, accounting, and vendor scheduling all in one place. He described how it connected real-time stock with e-commerce systems and even offered a free trial. Back to the deliberations. No one knew precisely what Juror 25's issue was. Was it outright defiance? An inability to understand the instructions? A personal conclusion formed too early? The note gave no clues. It was also important to clarify that alternate jurors were not part of the deliberation process. They had been sent home but left their contact information with court staff in case they needed to be recalled. As deliberations ended, the final 2 notes emerged. The first was routine. The jurors requested to leave at 5 p.m. The second, however, asked a pointed legal question. Referring to page 37 of the jury instructions, the jurors asked, if a person requests or asks for controlled substances, does that count as distribution? This related directly to one of the racketeering conspiracy's predicate acts, drug distribution. The language confused the jury, and they sought clarity. The judge suggested referring them to lines 1 through 3 of page 37. Both sides agreed to reconvene in the morning to finalize a proper response. The government, however, wanted a firm yes included in the reply, supported by the reference. The defense objected strongly, warning that such wording could unfairly bias the jury against Combs. Eventually, they agreed to continue discussions and submit written suggestions by 6 p.m. to be reviewed in court the next morning. The question of drug distribution under the RICO conspiracy charge was now front and center. Jesse noted how this was possibly one of the stronger predicate crimes in the government's overall theory. He then shifted attention to the complexity of the jury instructions. Normally, jury instructions can be monotonous, especially in simple cases like murder, where the law is more straightforward. But in this trial, the 62-page instructions were anything but simple. They were essential. They were detailed. They were a critical framework the jury had to understand before reaching any conclusions. Jesse emphasized their importance again. He gave an overview of the instructions, pointing out how they covered standard topics like the burden of proof, the distinction between circumstantial and direct evidence, and the role of the jury and the court, but they also delved deeply into the specific elements of the charges. For instance, in Count 1 racketeering conspiracy, the government had to prove that from 2004 to 2024, an agreement existed among 2 or more people to conduct or participate in an enterprise's affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity. Jesse turned to Elizabeth again and asked her perspective. How did the government fare in proving that Combs and his associates, his assistants, his bodyguards, his inner circle had indeed entered into such an agreement? Elizabeth said the idea of a criminal enterprise was central to the prosecution's narrative. They painted Combs as the leader of this alleged operation. They also implicated individuals like Christina Coram, his security details such as Diark and Fahimand assistants, described by the government as his foot soldiers. These individuals, according to prosecutors, handled tasks ranging from procuring drugs to reimbursing expenses for freak-offs and other private events. Elizabeth noted how much of the evidence involved text messages and communications that pointed to how these assistants operated, often coordinating with Karuma and others, even seeking reimbursement for drug purchases. Whether those purchases were small and for personal use, as the defense claimed, or part of something more organized, as the government insisted, was for the jury to decide. The next element in the jury instructions addressed whether this alleged enterprise had affected or was intended to affect interstate or foreign commerce. That meant the movement of people, goods, services, or money across state lines or internationally. Even local narcotics activity, according to the law, counted as having an effect. Jesse pointed out this tied directly into charges involving the transportation of Jane and Cassie for sex trafficking and prostitution. Elizabeth agreed and added that the government used flight logs to back this up. These records showed Cassie and Jane flying with Combs between major cities like Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, and even internationally to places like Turks and Caicos. The government argued this satisfied the interstate commerce requirement. Jesse pressed further, turning to the third and fourth elements, whether Combs knowingly and willfully joined the conspiracy, and whether he agreed that he or another conspirator would commit at least 2 acts of racketeering. That brought in the list of predicate crimes: kidnapping, arson, bribery, tampering with witnesses, forced labor, sex trafficking, drug distribution, and more. The jury would have to check off exactly which ones they unanimously agreed had been proven. Elizabeth offered her view. Aside from drug distribution and kidnapping, she highlighted 2 additional predicate acts that stood out to her: arson and bribery. Regarding arson, she referenced the 2012 incident involving Kid Cudi's Porsche. The government had walked the jury through how Combs allegedly orchestrated the attack. They described how Diark arranged a meeting between Combs and Cudi, and how Combs, accompanied by Capricorn Clark and others, later went to Cudi's home. The result: a Molotov cocktail ignited the vehicle. Photos of the burned-out car had been shown in court. The prosecution also pointed to messages from Cassie that described how Combs had planned to blow up Cudi's car while he was out of the country, creating a convenient alibi. Though female DNA was found on the bottle, the prosecution argued Combs was ultimately responsible. Elizabeth said the jury would need to consider how compelling that narrative was. As for bribery, Elizabeth pointed to the $100,000 allegedly paid to recover a surveillance video from a Los Angeles hotel in March 2016. According to the government, the footage showed an incident between Combs and Cassie. The defense claimed the payment was made purely for PR reasons to protect their public images, but messages from Coram to assistants, urging them to say it had just been a drunken night and to obtain the tape, cast doubt on that defense. Elizabeth suggested that the jury might see this as a calculated attempt to suppress damaging evidence. Jesse agreed. He noted that drug distribution, already a focus of the jury's question, was likely being heavily considered. The verdict form required jurors to indicate which predicate crimes they agreed had been proven. It was an important moment in the trial. But Jesse wanted to address another major concern: sentencing. If Combs were convicted of racketeering, the jury would be asked to follow up. Had the government proven that sex trafficking of Cassie and Jane was part of the racketeering pattern? If they said yes, that could trigger a special sentencing enhancement, more prison time, a more severe range of penalties. That's why the sex trafficking counts mattered so much, even beyond counts 2 and 4. He read directly from the jury instructions. To prove sex trafficking, the government had to show that the defendant knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, obtained, or maintained a person by any means. The judge had told the jury to use everyday definitions of these words. Recruit meant to seek or enroll. Entice meant to attract or lure. Harbor meant to provide shelter. Transport meant to move from place to place. Provide meant to supply. Obtain meant to acquire. Maintain meant to support or keep in place. Then the government had to prove that Combs knew or recklessly disregarded that force. Threats, fraud, or coercion would be used to cause the person to engage in commercial sex acts. A commercial sex act was defined broadly. It didn't need to involve money, and the thing of value didn't need to go to the defendant. There didn't even need to be a completed sex act. It was enough to prove intent and the underlying conduct. Jesse said that detail connected directly to Cassie's allegation about the 2016 incident at the Intercontinental Hotel. Even if there wasn't a completed act of prostitution, the government would argue it still constituted sex trafficking. Under the law, Elizabeth responded by breaking down what the prosecution likely considered fraud and coercion. She said that fraud had been a tricky element to grasp until prosecutors clarified it in pretrial arguments. They stated they intended to prove sex trafficking by fraud. Their argument, that Combs misled Jane, inviting her with promises of a wholesome, intimate evening, only for her to arrive and find entertainers or escorts present. Elizabeth said the prosecution claimed Combs would promise trips, gifts, or simple companionship, but deliver something else. That misrepresentation, they argued, constituted fraud. Then came coercion. Elizabeth pointed to testimonies from both Cassie and Jane, describing how they were pressured into freak-offs or hotel nights even while experiencing urinary tract infections or while on their menstrual cycles. These instances, the prosecution argued, were examples of coercion under the law, acts performed under discomfort, pressure, or medical distress, while Cassie's testimony included repeated incidents of violence. Jane's physical assault claim centered on one night in June 2024. The jury, Elizabeth said, would have to weigh those distinctions when deciding on the sex trafficking charges. Jesse then turned attention to another part of the instruction's credibility of witnesses granted. Immunity. The judge had told the jury that such testimony should be examined more carefully than that of an ordinary witness. They had to consider whether the witness shaded the truth to protect their own interests. Jesse asked Elizabeth who stood out most among those granted immunity. She named Brendan Paul and Bonabongalan, each significant for different reasons. Paul had been discussed well before trial, especially in connection with the Rodney Jones lawsuit, which labeled him a drug mule. On the stand, he firmly denied this, describing himself as a former athlete turned aspiring musician. His arrest, in Florida, had occurred during the same week Combs' homes were raided. He'd been caught with cocaine, which he said he planned to pack for Combs' trip. He got a good lawyer and made a deal, Elizabeth noted. But the jury would need to weigh the credibility of his testimony. Then there was Bonna, whose claims included being dangled from a balcony by Combs. The defense countered this by arguing Combs wasn't even in the state on the date she cited. The timeline was muddled, casting doubt on her account. Still, Elizabeth said Bonna and Brendan were memorable witnesses. Whether their testimony resonated with the jury remained to be seen. She also recalled other immunized witnesses. Kaplan, David James Butt said the jury might not retain every detail. Jesse brought up another unusual element in the instructions, voluntary intoxication. The judge had told the jury that if Combs was under the influence during an incident, it could negate the intent required for certain crimes like racketeering, conspiracy, kidnapping, bribery, or forced labor. Jesse wondered if the defense had emphasized this point enough during trial or closing arguments. Elizabeth couldn't recall specific references, but said the defense had suggested that violent events might have stemmed from alcohol or drugs, bad nights, not malicious intent. She brought up the March 2016 incident as one example. The defense painted it as the result of intoxication, not criminal intent. Meanwhile, the prosecution pushed back, pointing to cases like the June 2024 altercation between Jane and Combs. That time, both had consumed the same amount of alcohol. Yet, after Jane reportedly pushed Combs, he reacted via her, kicking her, dragging her across her apartment. The injuries were documented in court photos, visible only to the jury. Elizabeth said the prosecution wanted the jury to view that behavior as deliberate, not the result of impaired judgment. All this, Jesse emphasized, added up to a massive load for the jury. With no verdict yet, he wasn't surprised. He wouldn't have bet on a quick decision. Whether they'd reach a verdict before the July 4th weekend was anyone's guess. So much testimony, so much evidence, so many elements of law. Elizabeth thanked Jesse, and Jesse thanked her back. That concluded the latest episode of Sidebar. Jesse reminded viewers to subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere they get their shows. He signed off, saying he'd see everyone next time. Diddy's name once carried weight that no one dared challenge. The mogul who conquered the music industry, built empires, and amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. He had it all: success, power, influence. His name was synonymous with luxury and excess, the embodiment of the American dream for many. But behind the glitz and glamour of his empire, there was a side of Diddy that the public had never seen, a side that would soon come to light in a courtroom that would change everything. It all started with the rumors, whispers about business dealings gone wrong, about shady relationships, and about a man who had built his wealth on the backs of others. Some claimed that Diddy had made deals with people who were just as willing to break the rules as he was. Others speculated about the darker side of his success, the price he had paid for his empire. No one could ignore the stories forever, and eventually, they caught up with him. The courtroom was packed with people who had come to see the spectacle, the drama, and the inevitable fall of one of the world's biggest icons. It was an atmosphere unlike any other, a mixture of anticipation, excitement, and skepticism. Would Diddy walk away from this, or would the truth come crashing down, revealing a side of him that no one had anticipated? The world was waiting, and Diddy knew this trial would decide not just his fate, but also the future of his career, his reputation, and everything he had worked for. Diddy sat in the courtroom, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. The man who was used to being in control, who always had the world at his fingertips, now looked like a man completely out of his element. His legal team was trying their best to maintain the facade of confidence, but Diddy knew deep down that this wasn't just another business deal. This wasn't a quick fix he could buy his way out of. This was real. This was about accountability. This was about everything he had built crashing down if the wrong verdict was handed down. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that the charges against Diddy were serious. Allegations of financial misconduct, abuse of power, and unethical business practices had all come to light. The prosecution was relentless, pulling in evidence that painted Diddy not as a successful mogul, but as someone who had used his power and influence for his own benefit, no matter the cost. They painted him as a man willing to do whatever it took to maintain his empire, even if it meant crossing legal and moral lines. The accusations were damning, and Diddy's legal team worked overtime to counteract them, to convince the court that he was innocent, that his success had been built through hard work and legitimate business practices. But there was something in the air that told Diddy that this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another legal battle. There was something deeper at play here, something that was beginning to chip away at the walls he had built around himself over the years. His defense team could only do so much to protect him from the growing sense that the truth, whatever it was about to be exposed, and in the back of his mind, Diddy knew that the longer this dragged on, the harder it would be to maintain the image of the man he had worked so hard to create. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. The media frenzy outside the courtroom was overwhelming. Every move, every glance, every word was scrutinized. The people who had once idolized him were now questioning his every action, every decision he had made. It wasn't just the trial that was on the line. It was his entire legacy. The empire he had spent years building could crumble. If the jury found him guilty of even one of the charges against him, his public image, the persona that he had carefully curated, was at risk of being destroyed. And then came the day that would change everything. Diddy was called to the stand. The courtroom went silent. The world outside paused. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on charisma, savvy, and street-smart instincts was about to speak for the first time. All eyes were on him. The tension in the room was palpable. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Diddy barely heard it. His mind was elsewhere. He had always been able to control the narrative, shape the story to fit his needs, but this was different. This wasn't something he could control with money, power, or charm. This was about facing the truth, something he hadn't done in years. He wasn't just facing the court, he was facing himself. As he took the stand, Diddy looked out over the courtroom. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, and his own defense team were all waiting for him to speak. And for the first time in a long time, Diddy wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't the confident mogul anymore. He wasn't the man who could charm his way out of anything. No, today, he had to be someone else. A man willing to admit his mistakes. To own up to the things he had done. The morning after the verdict, the streets outside Diddy's estate were lined with reporters, flashing cameras, and a silence more powerful than shouting. He stood by the tall window in his study, watching the world try to make sense of his fall. The headlines were relentless. Mogul humbled, Diddy's road to redemption or ruin. But he didn't flinch. He had lived his life in front of lenses. Now he had to learn how to live outside of them. Inside, the air was still gone, were the assistants, the buzzing phones, the parade of industry figures who once couldn't get enough of his time. It was just him now, and a lawyer's voice echoing in his mind. Redemption is a journey. He had to believe that. His first step wasn't flashy. No camera crews, no orchestrated interviews, just a quiet drive to a small community center. In Queens, far from the glitz of LA or Miami, he walked in unnoticed and asked the director how he could help. The woman behind the desk looked up, stunned but not swayed. "We don't need your money," she said. "We need your time." So he gave it. He swept floors, packed food boxes, sat beside teenagers too young to know the full weight of who he had been, but old enough to sense he wasn't just another volunteer. He listened to their stories, and for the first time, he found himself offering nothing in return but silence and understanding. Weeks passed, then months. The public forgot. As it always does, a new scandal, a new target. Diddy became a whisper, still present, but softer now. He didn't chase the spotlight anymore. When reporters approached, he'd only say, "I'm working." But behind the scenes, change was happening. He created a mentorship program, one that didn't carry his name, no branding, no cameras, just second chances for kids who felt disposable. "You're not your worst mistake," he told them, though sometimes he still struggled to believe it himself. He turned down music deals, endorsement offers, even a to-law interview with 7 figures on the table. "I'm not selling my mistakes," he said. "I'm living with them." Then, nearly a year after the trial, he stood on a small stage at a youth forum. No spotlight, no entourage, just a folding chair, a mic, and a group of restless kids. "I used to think power meant being untouchable," he told them, "but real power is what you do when no one's watching, what you choose when you've already lost everything." The room went quiet, not applause, just understanding. Later that night, after the community forum ended, Diddy sat alone on the back bench. The applause from earlier now felt distant, just an echo in the walls of the community center. They had listened. They had even clapped. But the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. Not fully. He stared at the floor, fingers loosely interlocked, elbows on his knees. The sound of folding chairs scraping the linoleum faded as people left. One of the volunteers nodded at him on the way out. He barely noticed. His phone buzzed. Once, then again. He reached for it, half expecting another news alert. Another headline dissecting every word he'd spoken earlier that evening. But it wasn't that. It was a message. "You're not who you were. I see that now. Cassie." He read the words once. Then again, it hit deeper than he expected. She hadn't said much during the trial. Her testimony had been quiet but devastating. For her to say this, now, another message followed. "I'm in the city. If you want to talk, I'll listen." He stared at the screen. For a long time, he didn't move. The air felt thick again. Not with dread this time, with something else. Uncertainty. Hope. He stood, phone in hand, heart heavy and unsure. He didn't know what this meeting would mean. He didn't know if she was there to forgive, or just to speak her truth one last time. But he knew one thing. He would show up because whatever came next, healing, pain, clarity, it had to begin with truth. And this time, he wouldn't run from it. He didn't bring security. No blacked-out SUVs, just a black hoodie, jeans, and a long walk through the quiet streets of downtown. The city didn't recognize him like it used to. That suited him fine. He found her waiting outside a small coffee shop, already closed. Cassie stood under the dull glow of a street lamp, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Time hadn't dimmed her presence. If anything, she looked stronger. Now still, he slowed as he approached, unsure of how to start. She looked at him, not with anger, not with pity, with something sharper, clarity. "You came," she said. "I didn't know if I should." Cassie didn't nod, didn't smile, "But you did." They stood there in silence. Two people who had once shared the world, now struggling to share the same sidewalk. "I saw what you said. In court, at the forum." She finally said, "I paid. Didn't think you'd ever say it, let alone like that." "I didn't think I could either," Diddy replied, his voice lower, rougher than he meant. But it was the only thing left that was real. Cassie's eyes stayed fixed on him. "Do you think that makes it better?" He hesitated. "No, I think it makes it mine." She nodded, "Just once. That matters." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "I'm not asking for anything." "Good," she said, but her voice had softened. "I just wanted you to know that the person who did those things isn't the man standing here." Cassie looked down the street. A car passed slowly, headlights washing over them and then gone. "You're right," she said, "but that doesn't erase what happened." "I know, but maybe it means something that you know now too." He nodded. A long pause stretched between them. Then, softly, she added, "There are still others. People who never got to speak. People who are still trying to rebuild what you broke." "I want to help," he said. "Not with money, not with press. I mean, whatever way they'll let me." Quietly, Cassie studied him. "I don't know if they'll let you, or if they should, but that's not up to me. I understand." She turned slightly, then stopped. "But for what it's worth, this is the first time I've seen you look like you meant it." Diddy didn't move. "I do." Cassie gave the faintest of nods, then walked past him. As she passed, she said, "Keep showing up. For them, for yourself. That's all you can do now." And then she was gone. Diddy stood still, under the yellow streetlight, the city moving quietly around him, No cameras, no crowd, just him. In a moment that felt heavier than any courtroom sentence ever could. He had been judged. Now came the part no one could do for him. He had to live differently.